It would seem that any discussion or description of Mycenae has to begin with one of two things. Either that death mask of Agamemnon that you saw at the beginning of this video, or indeed this fantastic view looking out from the hill on which Mycenae is perched. The view is stunning, and in many ways it explains why Mycenae is where it is and why it was so important for a long time in history. Just look how far you can see into the distance. The whole of the Argive plain is below you, the fields, the distant settlements, and of course, right out there near the sea, the big city of Argos, which of course has nothing to do with the retail chain here in the UK, but is one of the most important northern Peloponnese cities and has been for millennia. But Mycenae dominates up here in the hills. Come up into the hills, make your way up towards Mycenae, and you realise what an impregnable fortress this was. And it's worth putting this into some wider context to see whereabouts Mycenae actually is within Greece. So here we are looking down on the eastern Mediterranean. I'm sure you're very familiar with this whole landscape now, the geography of it all fitting together. Here's that long island of Crete, which is where the Minoans were based, and further on into Greece proper, onto the mainland, we encounter this enormous peninsula, the Peloponnese. And the Peloponnese, almost a fortress island, it's linked to the rest of Greece just by the tiniest of pieces of land. But here is Mycenae, and you can see immediately the position that it holds here at the very top of this long vale, and commanding the position here and commanding views, as you could see, right the way across, in the sense that if anybody were to attack, then the Mycenaeans would have seen them coming from miles off. This really is a stunning sight up here, and it's well worth the trek to get to Mycenae, not just because of the actual ruins itself, but just a sense of this ancient citadel looking out over a view that in some ways hasn't changed since the times of the heroic tales of Homer and the Greek myths. Now, having mentioned Greek myths, they are going to play quite a role in what we're looking at today. Mycenae was already known even to the Greeks. They knew the name. The Greeks, the Romans knew of Mycenae. Its ruins were not completely buried, actually, not like Knossos. If you've looked at my video on the Minoans, then you will know that Knossos and other Minoan settlements had to be excavated from scratch. They really had no sign left of them at all. Mycenae was still, even into modern times, relatively visible. You could see that there had been something there, but nobody knew quite what an extraordinary place it was until they really started digging down at the end of the 19th century. And the hero of the day is Heinrich Schliemann, an amateur archaeologist from Germany, a wealthy man who came out to Greece and parts of modern Turkey looking for something very special. Now, he was not actually looking for treasure, but obviously if he found it, that helped him on his way. And my goodness me, as you'll see, he certainly found plenty of amazing treasures here in Mycenae. No, what he was looking for was something much more special, something much more ephemeral. And for that, it's worth looking at a timeline just to put this into context so that we can see how this all fits together. Because when you look into the past and you recognize the big waves of cultures, the civilizations that have occurred, that have risen and then fallen and disappeared, you're looking backwards in time. You recognize some of these names. We've all known about the Romans. People knew about the Romans for a long time after the Romans disappeared. Many later civilizations and even nations considered themselves later Romans. They thought of themselves as heirs to the Romans. There were even some people who still called themselves Romans until the Renaissance period. If you went to Byzantium or Constantinople and you asked them who they were Romans still. This was part of the Roman Empire, and we've had the Holy Roman Empire of Charlemagne. So the Romans were very much in people's consciousness, and because we knew about the Romans, we knew about the Greeks. We knew that the Greeks were there before the Romans. And from the Greeks, we have these stories, these myths of things that came before. And for many, many centuries, people just presumed them to be myths. And it wasn't until later archaeologists in the 19th century, the late 19th century, and the early 20th century, archaeologists such as the uh, British archaeologist Sir Arthur Evans and the German archaeologist Heinrich Schliemann began to go to Greece, which was opening up now a lot more, and began to dig and make excavations at particular sites, trying to prove that these Greek myths were true. And that was their aim. Their aim was to prove that these mysterious stories had their origins in earlier civilizations. And as you can see from the timeline, two, not one, but two earlier civilizations were discovered in this period. At the earliest extreme end, at the beginning of European civilization, the Minoans, and then after them, the Mycenaeans. And this completely changed how, particularly the Europeans, looked at their history. Suddenly, their history was thrown right back into a more distant period. And although they knew that before this, the Babylonians and the Egyptians and the Sumerians had all existed in the Middle East and in North Africa, they had no idea before this that anybody had come before the Greeks in Europe. Let's go and actually have a look at what Mycenae looks like. When you arrive and you climb up to the main entrance, you are faced with one of the most spectacular gateways in the ancient world. Here it is, the Lion Gate, and as you can see, it's named after this huge pediment, if you like. It's a huge triangular slab which forms the lintel of this gateway. It really is monumental. It is huge, and obviously it gets its name from the two lions that are carved onto this massive triangular slab. As you can see, they've lost their heads. They seem to be facing with their bodies sort of upright, slightly facing towards a column. Interestingly, this column is thinner at the bottom than at the top, which is unusual for columns. If anybody knows their classical architecture, you'll know that generally columns taper upwards. That's the effect that makes them look slender. But this one seems to be pointing downwards, almost upside down, presumably wondering that that might be the norm for this region. This might be what led to people like Arthur Evans perhaps to put their columns upside down, as well as maybe basing it on some fragments of what they thought they could see as columns in frescoes. But certainly this seems to be like a column, and it seems to be thinner at the bottom. As you walk through these gates, one of the first things you encounter on the right hand side are huge circular grave shafts. And although these grave shaft circles were originally outside the city walls when the city was first built, they were later incorporated inside the city. So when the city walls were expanded, these were now inside the city. Slightly unusual in a way. Most ancient cultures keep their dead outside the city. Very early on, they realized that that was the more hygienic way of dealing with their dead, but now they've obviously been brought inside. Possibly that may be why Heinrich Schliemann sensed there were some treasures to be found down here. Possibly if they were now incorporated inside the city walls, does that mean possibly that there was perhaps this was a royal burial ground? Possibly. Whatever the case, whatever he thought, he started digging here, and pretty soon he started to discover some extraordinary treasures. Perhaps the most iconic of all is this mask, and of course we call it the Mask of Agamemnon today. It's one of a number of death masks that would have folded around the face of the corpse, of the royal corpse, presumably because it's gold, but it's very thin gold, so it's very malleable. It's all stretched out now to look flat, which gives it a slightly surreal appearance. When he uncovered this mask, obviously Heinrich Schliemann is here to prove that the Greek myths are true, and so his first thought is, well, here we are. This is Mycenae. This is where Agamemnon was supposed to have lived. This is the Mask of Agamemnon. And he telegraphed the Greek king and declared, "Today I have gazed upon the face of Agamemnon." What a fantastic thing to be able to say. Later scholars have suggested or shown actually that this is not from the same period as he expected it to be from, that it doesn't actually fit the timeline in terms of the archaeological evidence, but it's still called the Mask of Agamemnon. And he found various other things that we can see now in the museum. Greek museums tend to be right next to the archaeological site. So if you go to a famous archaeological site in Greece, then after you've spent hours traipsing around the site, which is exhausting but wonderful, you then go into the museum, and again you end up spending another 2 or 3 hours in the museum, because that's where they've kept all the artifacts. And so you'll find all sorts of fantastic jewelry and fantastic things in the site next to Mycenae, although actually I think these things are kept in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, the capital. Heinrich Schliemann was not against showing off some of the finds that he made in the most spectacular way. This is a photo of his wife wearing some of the jewels that he thought had belonged to Helen. Now, this is not from Mycenae, this is from Troy. Heinrich Schliemann also discovered Troy. That's right, he was able to dig down 9 successive cities that were built on top of each other. Each time one was destroyed, and he, being an archaeologist from that period, he had no concerns about simply diving straight down and digging the stuff out. Archaeologists today are very different. They sift through every single layer to try and establish a pattern of development. Heinrich Schliemann dug right down, destroyed many later Troys until he reached the one that he thought belonged to the famous Helen myth, the famous myth connected with Paris and the wooden horse and Achilles. And when he found these jewels, he had his young wife adorned, if you like, with Helen's jewelry. A very, very famous photo. And to be honest, why the devil not? And climbing up to the top of Mycenae, you can find the palace, which is called a megaron in Greek. And this was a simple palace compared with what comes later in history, but this would have been the main stronghold and the royal seat of the local king, with, again, commanding views looking out. Interestingly, right at the end of Mycenae, tucked away behind massive walls, is a secret entrance to a reservoir. And if you go down those steps, as I did, even though it did say closed, you can get down a fair way, not the whole way, but this was where they stored water in case they were attacked. And this is actually quite an important point about Mycenae. You've seen some of the weapons that have been discovered, but those weapons look quite ornamental. They don't look as though they're particularly fit for battle. They're almost too ornate. But experts do think that the Mycenaeans were a lot more warlike than the Minoans. Now, if you remember, the Minoans had no defensive walls around their palaces and villas, whereas when you look at Mycenae, the walls are enormous. And other Mycenaean settlements around the Peloponnese show evidence of huge walls, massive Cyclopean walls. We call these Cyclopean walls. Things that are built like this are called Cyclopean because the later Greeks, thinking that this was the work of their ancient myths and the giants in their myths, they thought that the Cyclopses must have built them. So we still call them Cyclopean walls. Now, if there are walls And on top of that, you've got a reservoir in case you're besieged, and you've got emergency supplies of water. It does suggest, doesn't it, that these people were a lot more warlike than perhaps the Minoans were. There's no proof of that. It's just what you might call archaeological detective work. If we go back outside of the walls, again, we have got some other kinds of tombs. These are quite magical to enter. These are wonderful spaces. They're called tholos tombs, or sometimes people call them beehive tombs, because when you look at a cross-section of them, they look like a beehive, an old-fashioned beehive anyway, and you walk down this long passageway which sends you underground, and when you get to the actual center of the tomb, you're in an enormous circular space. These were before the later Romans came along. These were the biggest domed structures in Europe, and it's quite an experience to go down into one of these places. It's presumed that these were again royal tombs, or places where the royal family were left in state for a particular period of time, but there is a real sense of walking down into the underworld and experiencing a different existence, a different otherworldly realm. Remember that the ancients didn't really believe in an afterlife as such. You went down to the underworld. Your shadows went down into the underworld. We also have a huge amount of written evidence for the Mycenaean culture, and that's because thousands of these tablets have been found, and on these tablets are written various things in a script which we call Linear B. Linear B, because they're written on lines. You might remember from the Minoan video that they used, we think, Linear A. That hasn't been deciphered yet, but Linear B has been deciphered in the 1950s by a brilliant man who was an architect, but also worked on deciphering these ancient languages, called Michael Ventris, and he managed to solve what Linear B actually said. And interestingly, once he deciphered it, he discovered that the Mycenaeans spoke a kind of early Greek. So even before the real Greeks came down into this part of the world, there was the actual language was clearly some kind of early Greek. What happened to the Mycenaeans in the end? They disappeared without a trace, and they left their culture to ruin, and what ensued was a dark age. And we call this a dark age because there's no light shining through from it. There's no information. People stopped writing, people stopped communicating and trading in the same ways, and we find ourselves with a long period from about 1200 BC right the way through to the beginnings of the 7th century, maybe the 8th century BC, when the Greeks have arrived and things start to work up again, and a new set of cultures and civilizations emerge. And we still don't know quite what happened to the Mycenaeans. It's all part of something called the Bronze Age collapse. The Bronze Age collapse is a particular event that happened right across the Eastern Mediterranean. It affected all sorts of cultures, from the Egyptians all the way through to the Hittites, and even here in Greece, the Mycenaeans and the Minoans already had started to decline quite severely, and now the Mycenaeans disappeared. There were stories of sea peoples coming across in boats from the west. We still don't know who they were. Mycenaean and Minoan cultures are called late Bronze Age cultures. Once they've gone and the new system appears, people are using iron, so it's the Iron Age after that. Bronze stops being used for weapons. It's less effective, it's less efficient. So there we have it. Those are the Mycenaeans, and I hope you enjoyed looking at the Mycenaeans and finding out about them. I've always been fascinated by the Mycenaeans, and it was a great delight to actually get out to Mycenae and see the place finally, after years of having read about them. They're a fascinating culture, and if you're interested in finding out more about them, or would like to see some of the artifacts, and you're in Oxford, go to the Ashmolean Museum. There are some copies, very good copies of the mask, for example, and various other things that were found in Mycenae in the middle of the Ashmolean Museum. So well worth a visit. thank you so much for watching this video, and if you enjoyed it and it's fired you up to find out some more things about ancient cultures or art history, or if you're interested in language learning, or you're doing an EPQ, then check out my YouTube channel, which is called Lockdown Learning. Here it is, and hopefully you might find some things there that will be of use to you, and I'm adding to it all the time, so please subscribe and keep up with some of the new things that I post on there. Thank you. Goodbye.